Well, it's a new week, so that means it's time for a new episode of Zilog and Moto. I'm your host, Dave, and this is your mostly weekly look at the English language library of the 8 and 16-bit Sega consoles, consisting of 1,275, give or take a few games, across the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And if that number seems a bit high, keep in mind I said English language, as believe it or not, PAL games do count, so I'm including what ends up being a lot of European exclusives in that list. Also, when I say every game, I do mean every game. If you had any questions about that, I refer you to last week's video for Barney's hide-and-seek game, which honestly might even end up of my 10 best games of the year list before it's all said and done. Seriously, it's actually not horrible, especially if you're 3 years old. Anyway, if you're looking at all these games sounds interesting to you, maybe think about subscribing. It'll help the channel, and it'll probably be beneficial to you because, I'll be honest, as much as I'd like to have a new video up every week first thing on Monday morning, more often than not, it doesn't happen, unfortunately, especially when I get sick. And I promise it's not because I'm wasting time playing through Fallout 3 for the 4th time. Sort of. It is a great game, though, isn't it? In all seriousness, let's move on to the game of the week, a game that when I announced on Twitter this week that it was being covered, I had people saying that they'd never even heard of it. Now, granted, the person in question, Dudley of Jestrazine, and if you aren't familiar with the Jestrazine YouTube channel, you should definitely go give it a look. But anyway, Dudley's from the UK, and it's understandable that he might not have heard of this game because Jammit, as seen here, was only released in the United States in May 1994. At least, I think it was only released in the United States, although there is mention of an Australian release as well, which would be odd, as the European release was definitely cancelled. So, what is Jammit, you may ask? Well, as you can guess from the title, Jammit is a basketball game, with the title imploring you to jam it in the hoop. Or at least I hope that's the intention, otherwise we're talking about a totally different game, and one that's certainly not getting a GAVRC rating. Jammit exists because of developer Magitrek. Never heard of them? Well, what if I told you their full name was GTE Magitrek? Okay, yeah, that's fair, it's still pretty obscure, but Americans my age are at least probably familiar with the GTE portion of that name, and yes, you're correct, that means that Jammit came to the Genesis, and also the Super Nintendo, 3DO, and PC for that matter, courtesy of a phone company. If that sounds unusual, well, yes, it certainly is, and for the record, Jammit is the only title that GTE would release on a Sega platform, although they apparently announced and quietly cancelled a Sega CD beat-em-up called, wait for it, Hammer vs. Evil D in Soulfire, and yes, the Hammer in the title is Stanley Burrell, aka MC Hammer. Probably best that one got cancelled, for everyone. Okay, so we got a basketball game with no professional or collegiate license, from a developer who never released another game for the console and whose parent company is now Verizon. Is there any possible hope that Jammit is actually a good game? Probably not, but Virgin Interactive marketed the hell out of it, so maybe there's something here worth looking at? We shall see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of Jammit, and it's in pretty good shape all around. There's some light scratching to the outer cover, but nothing major, and no tears, rips, or gouges. And the hang tab is intact at the top of the case, something that I always have to mention in these clamshell releases. The inner cover, while being in similarly good shape, with no water damage or sun bleaching, does have a bit of an issue that you might notice if you look closely. Take a look at the clasp edge, and notice how that the inner cover doesn't go all the way to the edge. Now, normally there's a slight gap just to give the inner cover room to slide into the case, but certainly not this large. Not sure what they were thinking there, but this is how Jammit is supposed to look. This cover isn't just a one-off misprint or something. Not exactly a good sign for the rest of the game, but we'll continue. As far as the actual cover art goes, I don't hate it. You've got a generic basketball player going up to Jammit over the outstretched hands of another player, while the background is distorted to give it a digital look, the same with the logo in the center of the image. Again, it's not bad, but it's kinda It should be pointed out here that the Genesis version of Jammit was the first one to the market, and all 3 of the other ports used a different cover with a different logo. These redesigned covers matched up better with GTE's other sports game, Street Hockey 95, which only appeared for the Super Nintendo. I guess if Jammit and Street Hockey 95 perhaps had been more popular, we might have seen more games in this Streets Sports series. One other thing to point out about the cover is up at the top here where it says Free CD Music Sampler inside. This is related specifically to the Genesis version of Jammit being published by Virgin Interactive, and Virgin saw Jammit as an opportunity to promote various Virgin Music signed musicians. Since the other ports of Jammit weren't published by Virgin, this bonus disc is exclusive to the Genesis, and if you flip over to the rear, there's some more details about the artists that are included. Now, I don't actually have that disc, and honestly, I went and listened to the 6 songs that are included on it, and I'm not missing anything. The only song listed here that was a hit is Get Off This by Cracker, and I hated that song 27 years ago, and it has not gotten any better. As far as the rest of the rear cover goes, ugh. The screenshot design is nice, I suppose, and they're all decent quality. But what's up with this random greenish-yellow swoosh? The flavor text is all jammed together in a stylistic choice that's supposed to make it look, I don't know, avant-garde, non-traditional. It's fine, and at least it's legible, something that not all of the graphic designers get right when they're trying to do something different. Opening up the case and the cartridge and manual are both in great shape, with the manual looking barely red, with just some minor corner curling. Upon first looking at it, I was surprised at just how thick the manual was, which is a combination of having a decent amount of content and being on nice glossy stock. The manual fully explains the game, and I like the breakdown in the beginning with the controls for both the 3 and 6 button controllers. However, it's definitely a bit text heavy and could have used some more screenshots. There's just a lot for a kid to read here for what's supposed to be a relatively simple sports title. Also, it probably could have used a bit more proofreading, as apparently both Chill and Roxy are the best at slapping shots away from the rim, and there's supposed to be a chart at the end showing the stats of the different players, but it appears they forgot it. Oops. Okay, enough about all that. Let's get to the game and see if it deserved to be ported to 4 different platforms. Before I get too into talking about Jammit specifically, I should probably discuss the elephant in the room a bit. And that's, why does this game even exist in the first place? Well, there's another popular basketball series with street ball inspirations that you may have heard of called NBA Jam. NBA Jam was released in the arcades in April of 1993 and was massively successful. If you were an arcade operator in the summer of 93, there were 3 arcade machines that you had to have: Mortal Kombat 2, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and NBA Jam. NBA Jam, as the title implies, is an action-oriented take on basketball with a heavy emphasis on big slam dunks that itself is a callback to Midway's own arch-rivals. However, to call Jammit simply a rip-off of NBA Jam isn't totally fair to the title. But I mean, come on, the title's NBA Jam and Jam It, and the fact the game released just 2 months after the Genesis version of NBA Jam, it's a bit suspicious. Jammit actually is probably more accurately described as an amalgam of 3 things: NBA Jam, for obvious reasons, Mortal Kombat, with its digitized sprites based on actual actors, and the 1992 movie White Men Can't Jump, which ironically got its own game for the Atari Jaguar in mid-1995. Having said all that, if you were to describe Jammit as a street ball version of NBA Jam just to simply sum up the game for someone that wasn't familiar with it, that wouldn't be too far off, so let's just start with that. This leads into my first major complaint about the game, and comparing the game directly to NBA Jam makes this issue even more glaring. One of the reasons why NBA Jam was so massively popular was the fact that it's a licensed title, and not on a small scale either. NBA Jam features 2 players from every NBA team at the time, leading to a roster of 54 real players. Sure, maybe no one was choosing the Milwaukee Bucks or the Dallas Mavericks, but they were still there. Unsurprisingly, Jammit doesn't feature any real players, which makes sense as seeing how it's a street ball game. However, it doesn't feature 54 players to choose from. It doesn't even feature 27 players to choose from. 10 players, maybe? No? 5 players? Instead, Jammit's measly player roster consists of a massive 3 players. And yes, technically there is a final boss character included named the Judge, but for gameplay purposes, your choices are limited to just Chill, Roxy, and Slade. Now, I have to admit, I do like the forward thinking of the developers to include a female character to choose from back in 1994, but really? 3 characters? Would you play a one-on-one fighting game that only had 3 characters? Of course not. One argument for only having the 3 characters is the amount of speech samples that each has during gameplay. Spoiler, they really don't have that many. And I'll get more into that in the sound section of the review, but I still think they could have easily done a better job at this, and the game just feels lacking in the area. Now that we've established the game has a massive 3, arguably 4-player roster, what can you do with those players? Well, this is where the game makes up for its lack of players a bit, by providing a number of game modes that has enough variety to keep things interesting. In the inverse of the comparison to NBA Jam, one complaint you could possibly make about that game is that the game never changes. Every game of NBA Jam is the same arcade basketball game with the same rules, and the only thing that makes for the variations of the game is the different teams or potentially different difficulty levels. But in the end, every game is going to be similar in play. In Jammit, gameplay is broken into 8 distinct modes: 101, Sweat, Too Hot, Poison, Slams Only, Into It, Frenzy, and Cutthroat. Of those 8 game modes, all but Cutthroat are selectable in the 2-player mode due to Cutthroat's odd nature of being a every man or woman for themselves mode that involves each of the game's 3 characters. In each of the game modes, you're playing competitive basketball, but with the slight rule changes between each mode, it's enough to keep you on your toes, and a strategy that's successful in one mode may not work in another one due to the differences in the rules. For instance, in a mode like 1-on-1, where fouls can be called, you may want to take it easy on the pushing, but in Sweat, with no fouls available to the players, you have to up the aggression to have a chance. I really enjoy this, and it takes a game that could potentially get old after just a few games and really pump some life and replayability into it. I found myself being excited at the anticipation of, so what's next on the list, after beating a specific mode, rather than just, oh, okay, I guess I'll just play another round. Yawn. Speaking of what's next on this list, single-player mode has a very original progression system as well, to go along with the different game modes. To start the game out, you pick one of 3 characters, and then the game drops you into a one-on-one matchup against one of the other 2 characters. But before you start that game, you're given the option of wagering on the game you're about to play. Remember, I did say Jammit can call White Men Can't Jump as one of its primary influences. Each player starts out with $300. You can then choose to bet $100, $200, or $300 on the game, with the amount effectively correlating to the difficulty of the game. You could opt to only bet $100 on the game, to have an opponent that won't play quite so hard, but if you win, your opponent will still have $200 that you'll need to win away from them to move on. This risk-reward system means that players that choose to take the more difficult path of betting more money on the games will have a much quicker path through the game, and I think that's pretty genius, and really gives the player a solid incentive for trying to get better at the game. After taking all the money from your first opponent, you'll move on to the next style of game, chosen at seemingly random by the computer, with the exception being that Cutthroat will always be last, which makes sense with Cutthroat bringing everyone onto the court one last time before the showdown with the judge. For that final showdown, it's an all-or-nothing affair. There's no betting a smaller amount of money to get an easier match. Either you take him out, or he takes you out in game style chosen at random. And honestly, that's probably the way it should be. If the players lose, they can always try again via the game's password system. While I always prefer titles that have battery backup for save games, Jammit is simple enough, and correspondingly its password system is simple enough, that it's not a big deal that it uses password saves, so I'm not going to hold that against it. So we've got a 1 or 2 player one-on-one street basketball game with a decent array of game variations to keep things interesting, and a simple password system for continuing where you left off when in single-player mode. That probably sounds pretty great in theory, and in reading that summary, I certainly would have been interested back when this was released. However, what does the game not have? Let's get into that, and this review is going to take a decidedly more negative turn. The graphics in Jammit are a mix of standard pixel art, which is used for the 4 different basketball courts that you play out, and what appears to be a digitized animation for each of the player characters, similar to Mortal Kombat. And it's all pretty crappy. I appreciate the fact that they essentially had a different court for each player, and that you only see the judge's court if you make it to them, but they all look pretty rough, and it's very hard to pick out the details of each of the players, as the digitization process and the color scheme used makes everything look like a mess. From what I can tell, the Super Nintendo version's pretty ugly as well, but the 3DO version's a bit cleaner. Not that I'd recommend going through the effort of tracking down a 3DO copy to play this, but still. The game is also pretty limited on animation frames as well, with the action appearing jerky at times, especially in the dunk attempt sequences. More on those when I get to the gameplay in a minute. From a sound perspective, the game is ultimately somewhat forgettable. It features a few different background tracks that will play during gameplay, but none of them are anything amazing, and some don't even fit the action properly. There's one particular track that's essentially slow jazz, and it's fine, I guess, but it's totally out of place backlining a frenetic one-on-one basketball game. There's a nice feature in the options menu labeled Bass Boost, and I'm not exactly sure what turning the option does to the tracks, but I do definitely recommend turning it on, as it does give the music a much fuller sound. In fact, I really don't even know why it's an option, it should just be on regardless. The sound effects, like the music, are pretty average, with the usual bounces, swishes, and grunts that one would expect in a basketball game. What's not average is what the game refers to as trash talk in the options screen. Each character has a set of digital voice samples that can be triggered during gameplay. These do a good job of adding to the feel of the game, but I can see how some people might think that they can get annoying, especially since there's not that many lines of speech in the game per character. But at least the game gives an option to minimize them or turn them off completely. Finally, the gameplay. It's not good, but I will say it's better if you have a 6-button controller, so if you are going to try Jammit out, make sure you have one available. I think my main problem with the controls is that most things just seem so imprecise. When playing something like NBA Jam and moving your character around on the court and attempting to shoot or play defense, it all just feels right. But Jammit is all over the place. Shooting doesn't make sense at all. You can hit 2 3-pointers in a row and then miss a close shot that doesn't even hit the rim. Then when driving to the basket, the game will shift into a dunk mode that's actually somewhat of a throwback to the one used in Pat Riley basketball, except rather than being a purely timed event, the defender will also have to control where they jump to attempt to block the shot. I like this idea a lot, but more often than not, you're just frantically hitting buttons and hoping your player's in the right position, which I guess is a microcosm of the game itself. Not to mention other weirdness like players falling down from running into the backboard pole, the maddening game modes that require you to take shots from X's on the court that only register half the time, the fact that the game engine freaks out over more than 4 sprites on the screen. It's a mess. Jammit is a game that I think by and large has been forgotten to time, and for good reason. It's a game that, like many on this channel, is a good idea in theory, but there's often a wide divide between theory and execution. I get the idea of wanting to strike while the NBA Jam iron was hot and try to come out with something that would provide an alternative, but I believe the phrase is, if you come at the king, you best not miss, and Jammit is an airball. As a result, I'm giving Jammit 1 star. There's just no reason to play it when NBA Jam, its sequels, or even arch rivals is sitting right there. But if you really want to play something different, well, it's super cheap, so I guess that's nice. Don't say I didn't warn you when you throw your controller after missing a hot spot that went in for the 4th time in a row, though. Okay, that was Jammit. I can honestly say if you really want a few hours of street ball action, go watch White Men Can't Jump and Uncle Drew back to back. I guarantee it will be much more enjoyable for everyone involved. Here on Zilog and Moto, I've developed a few sort of rule of thumbs, perhaps, or axioms, if you will, over the last 3 years. One of those is, if a game has bats as enemies, it probably sucks. Well, here's another one. If a game is developed by a telecom company, it probably sucks. Words to live by from your humble host. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's not a review video. Well, see, originally it was supposed to be a review video, but then I combined a Christmas vacation with getting sick, and it's been a miserable week, let me tell you. So, instead, since the schedule has been pushed back, I'll be working on the 3rd annual year in review video for the channel, where I take a look back at the last year of games on the channel, and then put together some of the best and worst lists of the year, and finish things off with the 10 best and worst games so far that I've looked at over the last 3 years. I'm excited, and I hope you are too. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.